It segues well into the question you asked me about, do I think of myself as an artist or a cartoonist? I'm interested in things that exist between the panels, and I'm interested in things that don't fit well into anything. Like, I had Mouse, the book that I'm best known for, on the front table of my local bookstore in Soho for a decade. And finally I went to the manager and said, thanks a lot. It's been on your front table as a new book forever. He says, I don't know where to put it. So that to me is high praise. And I think this might be a book in the same category of where do we put this and what is it? Now it's part of my interest in where painting and comics overlap. This man is certainly not a cartoonist, but he is a man who uses pictures to tell stories, which for up to the Renaissance and beyond, that was okay. But after a while, it was pictures, they have no business telling stories. And, people like stories. I like stories. And so he was an artist that was telling stories, sometimes rather oblique ones, with pictures that sometimes seemed comics related in their connections, sometimes just visually connected in their connections, but pictures had connections with each other. From when he was a young child in Germany with Yiddish, famous Yiddish writer, now an oxymoron as a title, who had come from Lublin with his wife, the granddaughter of the wonder rabbi of Lublin. They brought him as an infant right after World War I. He grew up in Berlin. They would take him to the museums with them. He would dance in front of the pictures. They'd say, how do you like it? He says, it's wonderful. I talk to the pictures, but what's sad is they're not closer to each other so they could talk to each other when I'm not here. And that was an impulse that fed the rest of his life's work. So there was an artist named Franz Mazariel that is not as obscure as Si Lewen, but it's an obscure genre that he invented called wordless woodcut stories. And one picture per page, you'd get the story from pulling in what the imagery was, and it would continue on the next page. These became very, very popular and ubiquitous almost in Germany, and infected, let's say, a generation of artists who wanted to make this sort of thing. Si had gotten it for his gift when he was 13 years old, and it impressed him. He was already a working painter by the age of 14. He had his own gallery show, and he had one painting that he said was like Kathy Colvett's Welschmertzy, and said they loved it. And so he made 5 of them and sold each one as the original. He said, my career was off to a great start, but then Hitler came. So he then left for France at the age of 14 with his brother, his family staying in Germany. And there he would have stayed until they started deporting Jews back east, except for a fluke that involved, it's too complicated, but it's an amazing fluke that got him and his whole family to America in 1936 through the aid of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and of Admiral Byrd and Senator Robert Byrd, who an uncle of his helped, and by God, all of a sudden, they all got out when nobody was leaving in 1935, like it was already shutting down. They came to America. He's about 16 years old. He takes up his life as a painter. He has a fantastic year studying and going to the Met every day, talking to his pictures, walking across the park to go back home, until a year later, the sunshine goes behind clouds. He's beaten to an inch of his life by a policeman who's anti-Semitic. He had finally escaped from Poland, from Germany, and from the tightening noose that was Europe in general, to get beaten almost to death by an anti-Semitic policeman in Central Park. After a suicide attempt and trying to come back, he was shattered by this event. He joined up with a secret force called the Ritchie Boys of the Armed Forces in 1942 when he married his wife that he lived with until she died a year before him. The Ritchie Boys were used for their German language skills. There's a documentary called The Ritchie Boys in which Si figures prominently. He was on Normandy Beach right after the invasion. He was traveling through France and through Germany, and he landed with concussions, internal bleeding, fueled on schnapps at the gates of Buchenwald at the Liberation. And he said, I was through. That was it. He was turning himself in. He came back home shaken. While he was on the front, he had an idea for a book called The Parade, about the follies of war. When he got back to work, though, and he picked up his brushes, he said, I found out that I'd banished black from my palette. His pictures became very sumptuous, very pretty, almost post-impressionist. All of a sudden, as he was trying to rebuild a life with his wife that he was finally together with after the war, having children, living in New York City, the galleries were after him, the paintings sold. And they sold for, at the time, incredibly good money. They were selling for $10,000 or $15,000 a canvas in 1953 53, 54. This is like $150,000 now. So he had it made, except the darkness returned. The black came back into his palette again. One of the things he did in the late 40s was he began working on this book that he had a vision for called The Parade. And it's about the eternal march into war fever from generation to generation, over and over again, in a series of images that are occasionally Picasso-seeming perhaps. They are infected by modernism. So that you'll say, oh, this one looks like Paul Klee, this one looks like George Grosz. Eventually you find there's a common denominator. It's a man who breathed in the modern painting language and used it to tell a very moving story that was kind of like a jazz dirge for humanity. And it was about people making each other, just killing each other in large numbers, and finally exhausted, somebody declares victory, and they go home to another parade, a victory march of some kind, until they're ready for another cycle of war and death. This seems, as Einstein said, his fan who wrote the introduction, "The world needs you and your work," as Si quoted it for me, and it still does. It doesn't take a genius to know that. The introduction to the first volume in the early 50s was by Einstein, talking about how the world needed him and his work. This is a photo by a famous photographer named Lottie Jacoby, who was a friend of his and a portrait photographer. And here's a photo of Si by Lottie Jacoby, whose gallery drawings from the parade were first shown in. Now, as the dark paintings kept entering into his life, he was unable to keep that at bay, and he would be quarreling with his galleries all the time, like, art is not a commodity, I have to make what's in me. And a lot of his paintings were dark. Many of them became serial paintings. He was like a pathological serial painter. They would grow. He had a series, I won't find it here right now, but on the front of the book is the parade, and on the back of the same accordion is his backstory, his biography, an essay of appreciation by me, bits of his autobiography, and bits of various series of paintings that he did in different styles. So he said, art is not a commodity, art is priceless. And eventually that led him to say, and when it's priceless, it's worthless, but I quit. And then he started painting even more and better, I think, than he had been in his heyday. And it was really about pictures talking to each other. He'd take these expensive canvases that could sell, cut them apart, started mixing them with new paint, collaging his old canvases with new, and finding a new language. In his serial paintings, he did things like, he wanted to make 100 feet of paintings called The Centipede. But he's too prolific. So all of a sudden he said, that became a very long millipede. And he had several other series that have cinematic roots, as does The Parade in a certain sense, like silent film, but more silent. And he made these paintings that had like very filmic-like qualities, and to me it became a cousin of comics. But what comics would be if they weren't burdened with the word "it's funny," nor hindered from being funny when they wanted to be, and also had that quality of unfolding in time. So he made paintings as installations, and that's what gives him, I think, a franchise on the 21st century, because I've seen comics go from newsstands to PTA bonfires of burning them as causing juvenile delinquency, to being ultimately, ta-da, the graphic novel, Mao's and beyond, where there now can be serious literature in bookstores. And I think it's beginning to happen with painting. My shows were shown in an art museum, Robert Crumb's, Chris Ware's. It's becoming more common, but very often you're looking at things that were made for a page, and you take like the wood block that Daumier carved into and putting it on the wall rather than the print from that wood. And similarly, my work was made for a printed page very often, and what it is on a wall is whatever residue it still has. He was making things for a wall, but he was putting them as installations next to each other, and this I think is very inspiring for painters who are exploring exactly that now. And his stylistic shifts seem very postmodern, even though he was drinking in and spewing modernism, letting some pictures be light, some pictures be dark, some that looked expressionistic, some that looked surrealistic, all making up the same narrative relationship, and it gives him a franchise on the future. One thing that annoyed me is he died 10 days after seeing it, which annoyed me terribly. I'd finally made my oldest friend recently before, in 93, in 2000, he was 93, and then in 2016 he died just before the book came out. I'd shown him the first copy that came back, and he's going, it's a new genre. I never seen like this. I want to see both sides at once. He was so excited. He had doomed himself to obscurity. He sees this book and feels really I never dreamed this could happen. And he died 10 days after seeing it, as if this had given him permission to finally let go after being a very prolific painter for till the year before he died. And at that point, I found out while I was in the south of France, couldn't reach anybody. I wanted him to have an obituary in the Times. We sent it through the publisher to pursue that. And then the word that came back was, well, it doesn't seem to me, said the editor in charge, that he influenced the course of 20th century art. So maybe his main claim to fame is that Art Spiegelman is interested in his work, which I got furious about because, first of all, if nothing else, the obituary is one of the great short stories that appears in the newspaper, and his life story is very moving. It's a stirring story. I gave you a few little highlights. There's that. But more important, no, it's not about him affecting the 20th century. The reason I'm interested is he's affecting the 21st century. And that's why I devoted over a year to making this insane book.